Now, he is the infamous airplane hijacker who jumped out of a plane back in 1971 with 200,000 bucks in cash.
On a rainy night in 1971, a man walked onto a plane with a briefcase, asked for $200,000, and then vanished into the dark sky over the Pacific Northwest. He left behind almost nothing. No body, no confirmed landing site, just a tie, a few witness memories, and a question that has lasted more than half a century. On the night before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man walked into an airport in Portland, Oregon, wearing a dark suit and a thin black tie. He bought a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He carried a briefcase. He looked calm. He sounded polite. Nothing about him seemed wild or rushed. Yet within hours, he would force a passenger jet into one of the strangest crimes in American history. The flight was Northwest Orient 305, a short trip, only about 30 minutes in the air. There were 36 passengers on board, along with 6 crew members. After takeoff, the man handed a note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. At first, she thought he was another traveler trying to flirt with her. She slipped the note into her purse without reading it. Then he leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Miss, you had better look at that note." He said, "I have a bomb." She sat beside him and opened the paper. The message was direct. He wanted $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready in Seattle. He also opened his briefcase just enough for her to see wires, red cylinders, and a battery. Whether it was a real bomb or a fake, no one on that plane could risk calling his bluff. The crew passed his demands to the cockpit. The pilots informed air traffic control. The airline contacted the FBI. On the ground, agents and airline officials moved fast, but the man in seat 18, he never raised his voice. He ordered bourbon and soda. He even asked for the note back, a small act that showed how carefully he thought ahead. When the plane landed in Seattle, the passengers were released after the ransom was delivered. So were most of the crew. He could have vanished right there in the city, into streets, but he did not. He told the remaining crew to take off again. He gave the pilots a strange set of instructions. Fly toward Mexico City. Keep the plane low. Keep it slow. Leave the rear stairs down after takeoff. The sky over the Pacific Northwest was cold, black, and rough, somewhere between Seattle and Reno. The crew felt a sudden change in the plane. At 8:13 p.m., a pressure bump shook the cabin. The hijacker was gone. No one saw him jump. No witness on the ground saw a parachute open in the storm. They found nothing certain. No body. No parachute. No ransom bag. Just an empty seat. A black clip-on tie. And the start of a legend that would outlive presidents, wars, and generations. A man boards a plane, takes the money, leaps into the night, and disappears forever. But legends are often built from missing pieces, and missing pieces can hide the truth as much as they hide a face. Because if this man was careful enough to vanish in midair, what else did he plan before ever stepping onto that flight? The FBI called it their most frustrating case, not because there were no leads, because there were too many, and none of them fit perfectly. More than 800 suspects were investigated over the years. Pilots, skydivers, ex-convicts, even people with no connection to aviation at all. Letters poured in with false confessions. Tips came from strangers who swore their neighbor, their uncle, or their ex-husband was the man on the plane. Agents chased them all. Every single one led nowhere. The composite sketch didn't help much either. Witnesses gave different descriptions. Some said he was in his mid-40s. Others thought he looked younger, maybe mid-30s. Some said his eyes were brown. Others said they were unsure. In a case built almost entirely on human memory, memory kept failing them. Then, in 1980, something changed. A young boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River. He found bundles of cash, half buried and falling apart. The FBI confirmed the serial numbers. This was Cooper's money, nearly $6,000 of it. For a moment, it felt like a breakthrough. but it created more questions than it answered. If the money ended up in the river, had the man drowned upstream, or had he simply lost the bag during his fall, while he himself landed somewhere completely different? No body was ever found near the money. No parachute, no shoes, no bones, just cash, wrapped in rubber bands, sitting in the mud for nearly a decade. The FBI kept the case open for 45 years. It became the longest unsolved skyjacking investigation in the country's history. Agents retired. New agents took over. Files grew into boxes, then into rooms full of boxes. By 2016, the Bureau finally suspended active investigation. Not because they solved it, because they ran out of realistic leads to chase. They asked the public to send in any remaining physical evidence, then quietly stepped back. To many, that felt like defeat, the case that captured the nation's imagination. Discussed in books, songs, and late-night documentaries, would apparently end without an answer. But closing an active investigation doesn't mean a mystery disappears. It just means the trail goes cold in an official sense. Somewhere out there, people who knew the truth were still alive, and some of them were staying silent, not because they didn't know the answer, but because revealing it would change their own lives forever. One of those people wasn't a stranger tied to a random tip. He was connected by blood to someone the FBI had investigated decades earlier and dismissed. For years, his name sat quietly in old case files, treated as one lead among hundreds. Nobody realized that the missing piece wasn't a new suspect at all. It was sitting in a family's private storage, waiting for the right moment to be found. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. To understand what happened next, you have to go back to April 1972. Just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, a man boarded a United Airlines flight in Denver. He too demanded money. He too demanded parachutes. He too jumped from the plane mid-flight, vanishing into the night with $500,000 strapped to him. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy Roman II. Unlike Cooper, he was caught. Just 2 days later, FBI agents traced him through fingerprints left on a magazine in the cabin. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Investigators at the time noticed the similarities immediately. Same type of aircraft, same demand for cash and parachutes, same mid-air jump technique. McCoy had military training as a former Army helicopter pilot and skilled skydiver. He knew exactly how to survive a jump that would kill most untrained people. The FBI questioned whether McCoy could also be Cooper, but the physical descriptions didn't match closely enough at the time. McCoy was younger. Witnesses had described Cooper as older, so investigators moved on, treating McCoy as a copycat rather than the original. McCoy escaped prison in 1974 using a fake gun carved from a bar of soap. He was killed in a shootout with federal agents just months later. His story ended in violence, and with it, any chance of a confession. But his family did not disappear. His wife, Karen, and his 2 young children, Rick and Chantay, carried on with their lives, largely out of the public eye. For decades, the children stayed quiet about something they had discovered in their own home. A physical object, one that connected their father directly to a mystery the entire country was still trying to solve. They didn't come forward, not for years, not even when documentaries speculated wildly, or when authors published entire books naming their father as a suspect. They stayed silent through all of it. Later, they would explain why. They believed their mother knew more than she ever admitted. They feared what exposure could mean for her, for their family name, and for the quiet life they had rebuilt after their father's death. So the object stayed hidden, tucked away, waiting. It was not until both of their parents had passed away that Rick and Chantay felt free to act, with their mother no longer at risk of scrutiny or prosecution. The secret no longer needed protecting. What they eventually handed over to investigators was not a story. It was not a theory. It was physical evidence that had been sitting quietly in a family's possession the entire time. Evidence the FBI had never been given the chance to examine. And what made it remarkable wasn't just what it was. It was how closely it matched something no member of the public should have been able to replicate by accident. The object Rick and Chante handed over was a parachute. Not just any parachute, one that had been modified in a very specific way. To understand why this mattered, you need to know a detail from the original 1971 case that was never made public at the time. The parachutes given to Cooper on the tarmac in Seattle weren't standard equipment pulled from a shelf. One of them had been altered by an FBI skydiving expert just before it was handed over. The modification was small, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It involved how the reserve chute was rigged, changed in a way that very few people outside professional skydiving circles would recognize, let alone replicate. This detail was kept out of press releases. It wasn't in the news reports. It wasn't something an amateur hijacker planning a copycat crime could have known about or guessed by chance. When investigators examined the parachute from the McCoy family, they found the same unusual modification. The stitching pattern matched. The rigging style matched. It wasn't identical to a stock parachute of that era. It matched the specific, unpublicized changes made only to the equipment used in the Cooper hijacking. Alongside the parachute was something equally important: a logbook. McCoy had kept meticulous records of his skydiving jumps, as many serious skydivers do. The entries included specific locations and dates. 2 entries stood out: jumps recorded in Utah and Oregon, in the exact window of time surrounding both the McCoy hijacking and the earlier Cooper hijacking. For a man who was, according to official records, not connected to the Cooper case in any confirmed way, this was an extraordinary coincidence. Or it wasn't a coincidence at all. Investigators who reviewed the material described it as the strongest physical link ever found between a named suspect and the original crime scene. Not a theory built on witness memory. Not a sketch based on decades-old recollection. An actual object, with a traceable modification, sitting in a family's home the entire time. For a case defined by absence, by no body, no confirmed remains, no confession, this was different. This was something you could hold in your hands and compare directly to sealed FBI records from 1971. But physical evidence alone doesn't close a case. It raises a harder question. If Richard McCoy really was the man who vanished from that Boeing 727 over Washington state, how did he survive a jump that experts believed was nearly impossible? And if he did survive, why would a man who had just committed the perfect crime turn around and do it again? 5 months later, using nearly the same method, the answer to that question would reveal something about McCoy nobody had considered before. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. On the surface, repeating the same crime seems like the last thing a smart criminal would do. If Cooper's hijacking worked perfectly, why risk everything again just months later? But investigators who studied McCoy's background say the answer isn't really a mystery at all. It fits a pattern seen again and again in criminal psychology. People who get away with something dangerous rarely walk away satisfied. Often, the opposite happens. Success breeds confidence. Confidence breeds repetition. McCoy wasn't a desperate man looking for one big score. He was, by most accounts, disciplined, methodical, and confident in his own skill. A former Sunday school teacher, a Brigham Young University student, a father of 2. On paper, he looked nothing like the profile of a hijacker. That may have been exactly the point. If McCoy really had pulled off the Cooper hijacking without detection, he would have learned something incredibly valuable. He would have learned that his plan worked, that the jump was survivable, that the FBI had no solid leads, that he could disappear into a crowd and simply go back to his normal life afterward. For someone with that mindset, the temptation to do it again, this time with even more money, may not have felt reckless. It may have felt like refining a system that already proved successful once. The second hijacking, in April 1972, followed an almost identical structure. Same aircraft type, same method of demanding cash and parachutes, same in-flight jump. But this time, small mistakes crept in. A fingerprint on a magazine, a description that better matched local records. Investigators moved fast, and within 2 days, McCoy was under arrest. If McCoy truly was Cooper, this second attempt wasn't just a copycat crime. It may have been the same man, testing his own methods again, and this time losing the careful anonymity that made his first attempt untouchable. There's a chilling detail in how quickly the FBI closed in on him the second time. It suggests that whatever protected him during the first hijacking, whether it was distance, weather, unfamiliar terrain, or simple luck, wasn't present the second time around. He was more exposed, more traceable, and ultimately, more human. This theory doesn't answer everything. It doesn't explain, with total certainty, whether the man who jumped into the Washington wilderness in 1971 and the man arrested in 1972 were absolutely, without question, the same person, but it does something the case had never had before. It gives investigators a suspect connected not by guesswork, but by matching physical evidence, matching methodology, and a motive that finally makes sense. The pieces were starting to align, but one major question remained. If the FBI had access to all of this decades ago, why did the case stay unsolved for so long? To understand why the McCoy connection wasn't made decades earlier, you have to understand how the FBI evaluated suspects back in the 1970s. At the time, investigators relied heavily on eyewitness descriptions, flight attendants who saw Cooper for less than an hour, under stress, in dim cabin lighting, gave estimates of his age, height, and build. Those estimates became the baseline the FBI used to rule suspects in or out. McCoy didn't match perfectly. Witnesses guessed Cooper was somewhere in his mid-40s. McCoy was in his late 20s at the time. To investigators working with limited tools and no DNA technology, that gap felt significant enough to move on. But eyewitness memory is far less reliable than people once believed. Stress changes perception. Lighting changes perception. Time changes memory even further. Modern criminal investigators now understand that age estimates from strangers, given under pressure, can be off by a decade or more. What felt like a disqualifying detail in 1971 might have simply been human error. This is part of why the parachute evidence matters so much. It doesn't rely on memory at all. It relies on physical construction, a rigging modification that either matches sealed records or it doesn't. There's no room for stress or bad lighting to distort stitching patterns. When forensic examiners compared the McCoy family's parachute against sealed documentation from the original case, the match wasn't a vague similarity. It was described as consistent down to specific technical details that had never been released publicly, details that a hobbyist or an unrelated skydiver, even a very experienced one, would have had no way to guess. The logbook added another layer. It wasn't just that McCoy had made jumps around the right time. It was that the recorded locations lined up with flight paths and terrain patterns investigators had long associated with where Cooper may have exited the aircraft. None of this constitutes a courtroom confession. McCoy died in 1974, and no living person can testify to what happened in his own words. But taken together, the physical evidence forms something the case never had in 50 years. A connected chain, object, modification, timeline, and behavior, all pointing toward the same conclusion. For a case that spent decades drowning in false leads and unreliable memories, having something concrete to examine changed everything. It shifted the investigation from speculation to forensic comparison. Still, one uncomfortable question remained for investigators reviewing the new material. If this evidence was this compelling, why did it take over 50 years, and the deaths of both of McCoy's parents, before anyone outside the family ever got the chance to examine it? If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. The FBI's public silence on this new evidence wasn't necessarily reluctance to investigate. It was procedure. By the time Rick and Chantay came forward, the official Norjack case had already been closed for years. Closing an active investigation doesn't erase decades of documentation, but it does change how new evidence is handled. There's no active task force anymore. No dedicated agents working the file daily. Any new material has to move through a much slower, more careful review process, precisely because the case carries such enormous public attention. There's also a simple, practical reason for caution. This isn't the first time someone has claimed a family connection to Cooper. Over the decades, the FBI has heard dozens of confident claims, from relatives, from amateur investigators, from people who insisted they had solved the case. Almost none of them held up under forensic review. Agencies that have been burned by false leads before tend to move carefully the next time, even when the evidence looks strong. There's a difference, though, between past claims and this one. Most earlier theories were built on suspicion, resemblance, or family stories passed down without physical proof. This is the first time investigators have had an actual object, independently verifiable, that can be measured against sealed records rather than compared to fading memories. Still, verifying a decades-old parachute modification isn't instant. It involves cross-referencing manufacturing records, comparing rigging techniques with retired FBI specialists who worked the original case, and ruling out the possibility, however small, of coincidence or a common modification style used more broadly at the time. This kind of caution can look like silence to the public. It can look like the FBI is ignoring a breakthrough. In reality, it often means the opposite. When a case is truly closed, official statements come quickly. When something is being taken seriously, agencies tend to say very little until they are certain. That silence has left space for speculation to grow. On documentary channels, true crime forums, and long-running Cooper communities that have followed every detail of this case for 50 years. Some see the McCoy parachute as the final answer. Others urge caution, pointing out that even strong physical evidence isn't the same as absolute proof, especially when the only person who could confirm it directly has been dead for half a century. What nobody disputes, however, is that this is the most significant physical evidence to emerge in the case's entire history. Whether or not it proves McCoy was Cooper beyond doubt, it fundamentally changes how seriously his name has to be treated. And that leaves one final piece of the story. Not the evidence itself, but why his own children waited a lifetime to reveal it. 8. The truth his children finally told for Rick and Chantay McCoy. This was never just a true crime mystery. It was their father. Growing up, they lived with the weight of his story long before they understood all of it. Their father died in a shootout with federal agents when they were still children. Their mother raised them afterward, largely avoiding the spotlight, rarely speaking publicly about the case that had already linked her husband's name to one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. According to the children, their mother's silence wasn't just grief. It was protection. They came to believe she knew far more about both hijackings than she ever admitted, and possibly played a role in the planning or aftermath of at least one of them. If true, coming forward while she was alive could have exposed her to serious legal consequences, even decades later. So the parachute stayed hidden, not lost, not forgotten, deliberately kept out of sight, likely stored somewhere safe within the family for years. A physical secret sitting quietly while the rest of the world kept guessing. It wasn't until both of their parents had passed that Rick and Chantay felt they finally had the freedom to act. There was no one left to protect, no one left to implicate, only a truth they had carried privately for most of their lives. Coming forward wasn't simple. Even then, it meant permanently attaching their father's name, and by extension their own, to one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in the country. It meant inviting FBI agents, journalists, and amateur investigators into a story they had spent decades trying to live quietly outside of. They chose to do it anyway. Not for money, not for attention, according to those close to the family. They did it because they believed the public, and the investigators who spent careers chasing this case, deserved to finally know the truth, even if it came 50 years too late to matter in a courtroom. Richard McCoy Roman II can never confirm any of this himself. He cannot be questioned, cannot be tried, cannot offer a final confession. Whatever certainty exists now has to be built entirely from what he left behind. A parachute, a logbook, a pattern of behavior that fits almost too well to dismiss as coincidence. Maybe that's the most fitting ending a case like this could have. Not a dramatic courtroom reveal, but a quiet parachute, kept in the dark for half a century, finally brought into the light by the two people who had the most reason, and the least desire, to reveal it. Whether McCoy truly was Cooper may never be proven beyond every doubt. But for the first time in 54 years, the shadow chasing this mystery finally has a face, a name, and a family brave enough to finally say it out loud.